You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 13th of October 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
You, President Donald J. Trump, are a colossus who will be enshrined in the pantheon of history. Thousands of years from now, Mr. President, the Jewish people will remember you.
And Donald Trump is due to speak before the Israeli Knesset in Jerusalem after being showered in praise by Israeli leaders. We'll review this extraordinary day in Israel and ask what happens next as Gaza seeks to rebuild. We'll also speak with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts on a nervous day for markets amid US-China tensions. We'll be taking a look as well at Portugal with Monocle's Carlota Rebelo. Carlota, we have the results of local elections.
Yes, Chris, we have the results, and the overall winner is Prime Minister Luis Montenegro's PSD party. They won several of the municipalities, but also we saw the far-right win for the first time mayoral seats. We'll discuss the results.
Unpack all of that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Happy Monday, everyone. Hope you've had a good weekend. Welcome to the show on a tremendous day in Israel and the Middle East. After more than 2 years, the 20 remaining living Israeli hostages held by Hamas have been confirmed to be released this morning. U.S. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, is due to address the Knesset in Jerusalem, and he will be joining a summit later in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, together with Arab leaders and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So there is lots to unpack today, and I am joined in the studio by Alexis Self, Monocle's foreign editor. Lex, we're going to try and go through some of this. I mean, what a day kind of news in Israel at the moment. Let's maybe start with what we're waiting for, which is this speech from Donald Trump in the Knesset. It's been an incredible show leading up to this speech, sort of Israelis full of praise for the American role, name-checking Trump multiple times, mentioning everyone else who is there as well. Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Steve Witkoff, Kushner, Ivanka Trump. Everyone is there to sort of bask in this moment. There was a line, "The world needs more Trumps." What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen so many standing ovations during a parliamentary address. I was watching Netanyahu's speech just before we came on. It's unsurprising that this is the way, Trump is over in the Middle East for less time, I think, than it takes to fly from Washington to the region. So it's a very quick visit, and it's all about the optics. And lots of people clapping and chanting his name is obviously very good for his reputation. I don't think there's anyone but the most committed sadist who isn't, hoping that this is finally the end of what has been, even in terms of the tragic history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly horrific and bloody 2 years. So, yeah, it's a moment of optimism, and most people will be hoping that it's at least the end of this particular phase of fighting. A more humble leader than Trump, and indeed Netanyahu, might use this as a moment of contemplative reflection. But, he's looking to take the credit, and everyone, all those people you named and the Israelis seem very happy to endorse that narrative.
You mentioned that this is, at least in theory, the first phase. This is a ceasefire at this point. Donald Trump was very firm this morning, speaking to press even before getting to the Knesset, saying twice, "This war is over." Bibi Netanyahu had been maybe holding out a bit on that, although in his speech now before the Knesset, he did very clearly say he is committed to peace. I think that's what's been so interesting about the optics of these speeches, right? Because they've all been showering this praise on Trump, but Trump was forcing Israel's hand here, was forcing Netanyahu to come to the negotiating table and make peace. Is he really committed to it?
I think those words from Trump were a way of safeguarding the ceasefire, at least while he was in the air. And, not just the Israelis, but also Hamas. There would have been, there would have been a very strong response, you would have thought, if he landed and, the guns hadn't fallen silent. I think, it wouldn't be too much of a gamble to suggest that this isn't the end of the wider conflict. Hopefully it's the end of the attack on Gaza and the war in Gaza. I think the problem is immediately, and the reason that I was talking about the optics before is the way that it's being greeted. If you read the Hamas statement announcing the group's agreement to the ceasefire, it's full of triumphalist language. The occupation has surrendered. What it couldn't do with military power, superior military power, etc. Which is, of course, reads as slightly delusional when you look at the situation that the group is in, but it's also antagonistic. And then if you look at the Israeli response, especially Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the Knesset, it too feels like a celebration of victory. And I think if we're looking at long-term peace, and both sides are still more concerned with projecting a certain image, a triumphalist image of military victory, then lasting peace is still a way off.
Well, speaking of images, there are also the literal images today, which are positive, as you were saying. Anyone on either side will be at least happy to see this positive news today. The Israeli hostages are back, and we're seeing the first pictures of that. We're also seeing Palestinians returning to their homes, albeit in rubble. So to move to that a little bit as well, what happens kind of next in Gaza? Who's going to rebuild this territory?
Yeah, I think I felt this way actually in the first days of the war. I think one of the many tragedies or tragic ironies maybe of war is that it's sometimes required to, bring about long-lasting change, in this case peace. I think most of the world, this conflict has, been dividing people for a long time. But, now we're starting to see it having a very material impact on other countries' politics. Certainly that's the case in the UK, where a politician's position on this conflict can determine whether or not they win an election. So I think, even in purely kind of political, selfish terms, every country in the world almost, and especially in Europe, and the Middle East, obviously wants this conflict to end. I think that there's the will on the part of Middle Eastern countries that to really try and kind of push for something longer term than this. I think they're sick and tired of this conflict, again, from a political point of view, but also economic. These are countries that, particularly in the Gulf, are really trying to, attract inward investment and diversify their economies. And it doesn't help when, there's this long, and obviously the conflict has spilled over into other countries. And so, again, just looking at it from purely money terms, there's nothing less likely to attract, investor confidence than a kind of long-term conflict. So, yeah, I think the Arab nations, particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, will have to be involved, and other Muslim countries, Turkey. There's talk of Indonesia being involved in in helping to rebuild Gaza. I mean, obviously the big question is guaranteeing security and the demilitarization of Hamas. There's been talk of this international security force, those countries mentioned making up the core of it, but as to how big it will be, who will be involved, when it will deploy, none of this detail. It's all up in the air. None of it is agreed.
It is all up in the air. Some of this will be decided or at least discussed at a summit in Sharm el-Sheikh later today, with many of these leaders in attendance. But we'll have results of that tomorrow. But just finally, Lex, the end of one Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, that was announced last week marks the start of the race for 2026. And this was, of course, also leaned into by Israeli leaders, the inevitable renomination of of Donald Trump. Israel says it will rally world leaders to the cause.
Yeah. Well, we were just talking before we went on air. The Nobel Peace Prize has even become a new front in the culture war. It's like, whose team are you on? Whose side are you on? Who you want to win the Nobel Peace Prize now says everything about your politics. The same as what shops you go to and your coffee order. I think the problem is that you then demean the prize itself. It becomes something that you gloat over and you kind of vote for your favorite politician to win, not based on anything other than the fact that you like them or you hate the other side. Look, if Trump's big thing that he wants is the Nobel Peace Prize, and he does manage to lay the foundations for the end of this decades-long conflict that's cost so many lives and so much grief, then give him the Nobel Peace Prize. That's what I say.
We'll see what happens in a year's time. Plenty more time to discuss that. Thanks very much, Lex. That was Monocle's foreign editor, Alexis Self. And now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. French President Emmanuel Macron says he will stay in office to keep stability in the country despite opposition calls for him to resign. His comments come as the reinstalled Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu's new government took power. The nation now waits to see if the new team can deliver a workable budget. Madagascar's president says a coup is underway after an elite army unit joined protesters and refused orders to fire on crowds. Water and power outages last month sparked the unrest. Demonstrators are calling for the president to step down, an end to corruption, and a radical overhaul of the political system. And art lovers from around the world are flocking to London for the Frieze Art Fair. More than 280 galleries are showing modern works in Regent's Park, alongside big-name auction sales. Frieze also announced a new fair in Abu Dhabi, part of the city's push to become a global art hub. Those are the day's stories. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura, and we will have more on Frieze tomorrow on The Globalist. You can tune in for that. But for now, here on Monocle Radio and The Briefing, it's time for a look at the latest business headlines. And for that, I am joined once again by Bloomberg reporter Ewan Potts. Ewan, great to have you on the show on a day that is, well, kind of positive. There was a massive sell-off of stocks globally on Friday after a renewed start to a trade war between the US and China. What's been going on today?
Hello, Chris. Yeah, investors around the world have been waking up to tacos for breakfast today. The taco trade, Trump always chickens out, has been on the cards all weekend after the US president softened his rhetoric towards China. As you mentioned, that was a really sharp sell-off on Friday. Shares and cryptocurrencies tumbling after the US president threatened an extra 100% tariff on Chinese imports. At one point, Bitcoin was down more than 12%. Some of the other smaller coins seeing even bigger drops. And the US benchmark stock index saw its worst session since April. The tech-heavy Nasdaq was even harder hit. But the bet this morning is that those 100% tariffs aren't going to happen, or if they do, like last time, they will be short-lived. So stocks gaining here in Europe, and US futures pointing to a positive start for the S&P, up around about 1%, and the Nasdaq set to open up even more than that.
Ewan, I just have to ask, you talk about tacos for breakfast. I mean, if they were going to have tacos for breakfast today, why didn't they have tacos on Friday? I mean, why was there a belief back then that Trump was serious, and now, once again, there's a belief that he's not?
Yeah, it's a real question, isn't it? If I had the exact answer to that, I'd be a very rich man probably, and not talking to you. I'd be counting the millions in my portfolio. But the truth is that stock prices are very high at the moment. We've seen an enormous rally since those lows back in April, which was, of course, tariff related as well. So you could say that the whole year has been one big taco trade. But there were fears that President Trump's new, more aggressive tone on Friday was going to reignite the trade war between the world's two biggest economies. Remember, there's a truce which has already been extended once. That's going to expire at the start of November. So there's still trade risks in the background. But the broad feeling amongst investors is very much a bullish one. Stocks have been soaring in markets right around the world. The S&P 500, the benchmark in the US, has been hitting fresh record highs all year long. So the trouble is, when something bad happens, there is a danger that the sell-off does come quite sharply, and that's what we saw on Friday.
And meanwhile, Ewan, as we do hope or wonder what will happen with US-China trade talks, as you say, with the sort of deadline for those talks, there is some data that actually China's economy is surprisingly resilient at the moment.
Yeah, really interesting this. Earlier in the year, after Donald Trump ramped up those tariffs on Chinese imports, there were fears that Beijing would divert exports to other markets. Well, today we got some data which suggests that is exactly what is happening. Chinese exports rose by 8.3% in September from a year earlier. That was far ahead of estimates from economists and the fastest pace in 6 months. Shipments to the US were down by more than a quarter. So that meant that exports to non-US destinations grew by almost 15%. Now, the interesting question is how much of these exports are still indirectly destined for the United States. Vietnam, for instance, was one of the trade partners seeing the biggest increases. China's exports to Vietnam jumped almost 25% on a year ago, even though the Vietnamese economy is slowing. So that suggests perhaps that something fishy is going on. Analysts at Capital Economics describe Vietnam as the top rerouting hub. But regardless of what's happening to all these exports, the bumper numbers are definitely a welcome boost for the Chinese domestic economy. It's facing deflation and still struggling to overcome that massive property bust of a few years ago.
Vietnam, the rerouting hub, yet another aspect of this trade war that we won't get into here. Ewan Potts from Bloomberg, thanks very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now on today's briefing to Portugal, which this weekend saw local elections that were seen really as a major test of support for the far right, the Chega party, which was running candidates in 307 out of 308 municipalities, I understand, hoping to take the reins of power in some of them. In the end, it was the centre-right that seemed to have mostly held its ground. I'm joined right here in the studio by Carlotta Rebello, Monocle's senior foreign correspondent. Carlotta, welcome to the show.
Bon dia, Chris. How are you?
I'm very good. You've been watching everything happening in Portugal over the weekend. What do you make of these results?
Yes, it is interesting. As you say, this was not just a test for to gauge the support of the Chega party, but also a test for Luís Montenegro's government. Now, as you might remember, the Prime Minister, the embattled Prime Minister, seeked re-election. We've had a lot of elections over the past year, a couple of years. So this was really a test to assess what the population felt about the country. So I think despite his name not being on the ballot, the main winner was Montenegro, because his party, PSD, either on its own or in a coalition with other parties, was the overall winner of the night. And this includes as well several of the 5 of the largest city councils, including the mayor for Lisbon and for Porto. Now, turning our attention to Chega, I think it's fair to say that it underperformed expectations. Now, it only managed to secure mayoralties in 3 places, in Albufeira, in Trocamento and São Vicente. Now, these is respectively somewhere in the south, somewhere in the middle of the country, and somewhere in the island of Madeira. But I think it really shows that this expectation that Chega would sweep at least closer to the big cities didn't really happen. And it will be interesting to see what that means for the internal structure of the party and the people nominated by André Ventura. We need to remember that one of the main criticisms of the far-right Chega party is this idea that's a party that's around just one personality, the leader, and these results seem to attest to that theory.
It is so interesting when, say, a party like Chega underwhelms in the kind of environment that we're currently in, Carlotta, in so many countries where it seems like typically the far right overperforms. Do we have an explanation for that? I mean, you mentioned the personalities, maybe the 2 personalities, the leader of Portugal and the leader of Chega. Is that part of it? Or I guess, put it another way, does Chega take more of the blame here, or is it more a sign that the centre-right is stronger than people expected?
I think the latter. I think it's a sign that the centre-right is stronger than what people expected, because we also saw the centre-right take some of these municipal seats from the Socialist Party, so from the centre-left. So I think this was really solidifying the position of the centre-right at the moment. Overall, it is clear that there was a shift towards the right, but not to the far right, which was a bit, for a lack of a better word, a bit of a jump scare last time around with the legislative parliamentary elections, where Chega became the second biggest political force in the country. Now, Chega did increase the amount of votes and the percentage of votes that it had in these local elections, but that didn't necessarily manifest in seats. So it will be interesting to see not just how this will affect that party, but we mentioned the Socialists, also that, the Socialists, since they lost the legislative elections, they've been on a bit of identity crisis, trying to find, as they did, a new leader, trying to find a new voice. And this was, keeping with stability, despite losing some key places. It wasn't a big loss, which I think signals that the party is slowly finding its feet again and perhaps getting ready for next year's presidential election.
And just maybe finally, Carlotta, a word on next year's presidential election. If this result was an underwhelming one for Chega, everything we've been talking about, how does that bode for the presidential election in January? What are we expecting?
The presidential election will be an interesting one to watch. Remember what I was just saying about Chega's that theory of it being a cult of personality party? Well, Andrea Ventura is running for president, so that will be a real test. And so far, people are still announcing their intention to run, but the majority of the candidates so far are slightly aligned to the right more than to the left. With presidential elections, it's not a party running, it's a candidate, and parties can choose to support them or not. But so far, all of them are more towards the right, which again it will be interesting to observe who ends up winning, considering these results where the centre-right solidified its position in the country.
Just to clarify, is there runoff in presidential elections in Portugal, or just one whole big shebang?
Just one whole big shebang.
Monocle's Carlotta Rebello, thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Rebello. Our researcher was Joanna Moser, and our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.